Ever since Sonic Frontiers released, there has been a revitalized effort for Sega to tell better Sonic stories and kind of recapture that magic from the old days when they were telling stories like Sonic Adventure 2, which I think they did a really good job of doing. With the success of the Sonic the Hedgehog movies, there's been an overall revitalized focus for the franchise. And one of the first orders of business for Sega in this new era of Sonic where things are being taken more seriously is to clean up the lore and create one unified timeline across IDW comics as well as the video games. So the question is, now that, you know, they're trying to do the everything is canon meme, but in real time by unifying the games and comics, there's real questions about, you know, when does certain events take place? When does Sonic Frontiers take place? When does the Metal Virus arc take place? When does Sonic Prime take place? Apparently we'll find out soon. What are some of the issues with this? Well, it looks like we have some answers, but also some questions to get into today with some new developments and new statements. So before we do that, please subscribe to the channel with all notifications. I'll give you a second. And please join the comments down below. I'm trying to figure out just when Sonic Frontiers takes place. So just to get you up to speed, in case anyone needed any more confirmation, here is the official statement from the Sonic social media team that as of right now, what we know to be true is that the comics are canon to the games. Let's roll the clip.
One question in there, is IDW canon? It is canon. It does take place right after Forces.
So this hasn't really come to much of a surprise. For those of you who have been paying attention to the channel for a while, we've known that IDW's been canon because they've said it so many times. It's been said a couple times on Ian Flynn's podcast. I'm pretty sure he actually said it recently as well. I can't find the clips right off the top of my head, but it's been stated many times that IDW is canon to the games. There's been evidence because there's actually been some minor references to IDW in Sonic Frontiers. So let's roll the clip.
I bet Tangle would love climbing around these ruins.
So now this brings us into the question, and we'll get into the new lore that was just revealed as well. But when does Sonic Frontiers take place? When does IDW take place? I would assume that everything that's happened in IDW is pre-Sonic Frontiers, and all the adventures that we had in the comic books, all the characters are now established in the Sonic universe prior to Frontiers. So the new lore we're about to get into today revolves around Sage, who is a new character that was revealed in Sonic Frontiers, and her relation to the IDW comics. It's actually very interesting, and it really did spark my curiosity about this discussion, which is why I made the video. I kind of want to hear what your guys' take is. So on Ian Flynn's podcast, he was asked a question about will Sage ever appear in the IDW comics. Considering that IDW is actually technically pre-Sonic Frontiers, and they're trying to unify the timeline, and eventually within the next like 5 years or so, we'll get a new mainline Sonic game, there's going to be this crash course of some sort. Can you simply write a comic that's supposed to be canon to the games and introduce a bunch of new ideas and mechanics, new storylines, new plots, new characters, and have it all take place before the most recent game? What about 10 years down the line? Like, what happens when the next Sonic game comes out? Well, this question is what popped into my head after hearing this new lore. So why don't we roll the clip, and then we'll get into the discussion and see what you guys have to say.
Let's do it. Starting with this one, we're going to start with standard questions. This one is from Volcanic SF. So when does Sonic Frontiers take place in terms of the comics?
After where we have seen thus far. Once you see Sage show up, you know Frontiers has happened.
Is that a confirmation that Sage is going to show up?
I mean, I figure it's going to happen eventually.
Hashtag knowing smile?
No, just hashtag common sense.
So, in this fandom? What are you talking about? Here's one from Levi C.
So there you have it. That is very interesting lore for several reasons. So this really plays into what Sage's role is going to be going forward in the franchise. Clearly, I mean, if you consider both endings of Sonic Frontiers, it's clear that Sage lives. And based off of the statements from Ian Flynn, it's very possible that she's going to be a recurring character in the franchise going forward. There's going to be this very interesting dynamic, I feel like, post-Frontiers. It's going to be interesting to see how she interacts with Dr. Eggman. Is she still going to be that voice of reason for Eggman? Because I don't really get the vibes in Frontiers that Sage is evil, but there is this level of loyalty to Dr. Eggman, who is her father. Is she going to assist Dr. Eggman in trying to take over the world? I think we got some hints in DLC 3 about that. But this also leads to the question that eventually in IDW and in all Sonic media in general, if you think about Prime being canon, Frontiers being canon, IDW being canon, we're gonna have to address some questions, and we're gonna have to sort out this timeline. Because if you think about the current Sonic timeline post Frontiers, Frontiers, and, you know, with all these new statements, the lore team and everything like that, it goes something like this. So we have Sonic Forces right here, which introduces the Phantom Ruby, and honestly creates some other questions as well with like time travel and Sonic Mania and everything like that. But we have Sonic Forces, which eventually, once Sonic Forces ends, we get right into the IDW comics. In the IDW comics, a lot of stuff happens. Tons of brand new characters are introduced into the story. We have big arcs like the Metal Virus. We have Dr. Starline. We have Surge and Kit. Like, we have all this crazy stuff that happens in the IDW comics, but this has to precede Sonic Frontiers. Like, IDW has to lead into Frontiers due to the fact that IDW is a direct sequel of Sonic Forces. So everything that happens right here between IDW and Sonic Frontiers is all pre-Frontiers. Some people might actually take issue with this, like limiting everything that happens in these comics, and trust me, there's a lot, to just what happens in between here could be limiting, especially when you consider that we have Frontiers that released with all of its lore, and then it's like, what happens after Frontiers? What happens when we get into Sonic Frontiers 2? So while it's really cool that we're going to potentially see Sage in the IDW comics, not confirmed, but it's likely that at some point in the future, she may make an appearance, or even just in general in the Sonic franchise, she'll have a role going forward. That's going to be really cool to see, because I'd like to see that, and that's like one of the big revelations. But I think Sega is going to have a big problem to address with this everything is canon stance that they have, and that is going to be making sure that, since this is the established position going forward, is making sure that it all ties in together. Because listen, there's been a lot of like weird inconsistencies with the lore, but since their position is trying to make it all unified, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention going forward. I would imagine at some point in the future, they're going to have to address this problem right here. And here's the big problem. So obviously IDW leads in the Frontiers, but assuming IDW and Sega's partnership for the Sonic comics continues to go forward, they're going to have to deal with this problem where eventually Frontiers is going to happen in the IDW timeline. Like if Sage ends up appearing, they're going to have to address this. How are they going to handle the overlap between Frontiers and IDW as we move into the eventual sequel to Sonic Frontiers? How are they going to tie these two plots together? Is there going to be like a Frontiers arc for IDW, even though the game's already a year old? Are the events of Frontiers going to happen in the background of IDW? Will IDW Sonic just permanently tell itself within the past, so just permanently be stuck in between Frontiers? This is something that I think is a bit of an issue, and I think when they talk about everything is canon, everything's one timeline, these are some really major questions they're going to have to address if they want to keep this position that IDW is canon. Consider this, we are already 2 games after Frontiers. I mean, Sonic Superstars technically takes place in the past, but Sonic Dream Team is coming out next week, by the way, which is a modern Sonic game. So this could be something that's post-Frontiers, maybe it could be before Frontiers, I don't know. Due to the fact that it's like a dream story, it could be stuff that's so insignificant that it doesn't really matter when it happens, but we could just say, oh yeah, after Frontiers, whatever, it's in a dream. Similar to maybe some of the arcs in Sonic IDW, it could be like, all right, you know, this stuff isn't that important, nothing that happens really changes the fate of Sonic, the lore, anything like that. But again, that limits the comics and what they're able to do. Realistically, we are going to be 2 games past IDW with Sonic Dream Team's release, which means IDW is technically behind Frontiers and now Dream Team. So is it that significant? I don't know. The main takeaway of this video though is this big crash course between Frontiers and IDW. If Sage ends up appearing in the IDW comics, we're gonna have to deal with what it does going forward. Like what happens in between Sonic IDW, how does it handle the Sonic Frontiers arc, and then, you know, what it does going forward into Sonic Frontiers 2, or, you know, whatever the sequel is. How is Sage going to be reintroduced to the Sonic franchise? How is she going to be introduced to IDW? Like, what's her purpose there? What is she going to be doing? What's her relationship to Metal Sonic? Like, all this stuff. There's so many questions that need to be addressed, all within this span right here. Right here is going to be the big, well, what I'm circling right here, I'm making a big scribble right here. We're going to have to address this right here. And Sega is going to have to be very careful not to screw it up. And just to make this timeline a bit more confusing, and I'd like to hear your opinions about this, I'd like to take the newly canonized Sonic Prime and throw it onto your timeline. And now what happens? Good luck.